Bine ați revenit după o pauză bine meritată pentru răbdarea și interesul cu care ați asistat, audiat prelegerile până acum. Îmi revine plăcerea să-l introduc pe Peter și haideți să ascultăm cu interes prezentarea lui, iar la final să ne folosim de ocazia aceasta de a întreba unul dintre probabil cei mai buni sau apologeții emergenți a Europei creștine, să profităm de ocazia asta și să-i adresăm tot felul de întrebări. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for this opportunity to join in with this conference. And again, as someone who is not a specialist in this area of postmodernism, I hope I can nonetheless say some illuminating things for you. I'm going to try and do this talk in English without a translator by having all of the quotations that I'll be using in Romanian on the PowerPoint. Hence, I've got my English version down here and Romanian over there, and I shall try and juggle all of the technology and hopefully make our way through. Let me begin with quite a long quotation from St. Augustine, who in his book, The City of God, opens with this analogy between talking about the city of God, the kingdom of God, and the city of the world, in that sort of Pauline sense of the world. And he analyzes history up until his day in terms of the ongoing interaction and conflict between the city of God and the city of the world. And he says that two cities have been formed by two loves. The earthly by the love of self, even to the contempt of God. The heavenly by the love of God, even to the contempt of self. The former glories in itself, the latter in the Lord. The one delights in its own strength, and the other says to its God, I will love thee, O Lord, my strength. And therefore the wise men of the one city, living according to man, have sought for profit to their own bodies or souls, or both. And those who have known God glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened, professing themselves to be wise. Of course, Augustine is quoting from Paul there. That is, glorifying in their own wisdom, they became possessed by pride. They became fools and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man and birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. For they were either leaders or followers of the people in adoring images and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. But in the other city, the city of God, there is no human wisdom, but only godliness, which offers due worship to the true God and looks for its reward in the society of the saints, of holy angels, as well as holy men, that God may be all in all. So for Augustine, there's really only two ways of being human, only two ways of having a human society, only two ways of viewing the world, either looking towards God in adoration or turning your back on God and therefore having to look to the created rather than the Creator as the foundation of your life. You can tell which Augustine thinks is the wise way of living. So, see, you must remind me to press this button, otherwise things will be difficult for us. I apologize. So we have these different cities or different world views, if you like. We've already had a little brief introduction to world views. Think of it as your mental dwelling place, your mental home in the world, as it were. And to borrow a phrase from Richard Rorty, who's a postmodern philosopher, you can think of a worldview like, a bit like a mirror. It reflects your image of reality back to you, as it were. Worldviews tend to become self-reinforcing in that once we have a certain way of viewing the world, we tend to sort of use it as a sieve to only allow us to notice the things that chime with our view of things, and to ignore things that don't fit with our view of the world. And of course, I would say that whether or not our worldview reflects reality to us depends upon whether or not our worldview is true. And being true is simply a matter of telling it like it is, of being true to the facts. You have a truth claim, which is about the world, and if the world is the way that the truth claim says it is, then it is true. This is very easily grasped and diagrammed. Here we have one picture and another picture, and we have the phrase, "the cat is on the mat." Now, in this picture, the phrase, "the cat is on the mat," is true, because the cat is on the mat. Okay? Haven't lost anyone, have I? In picture number 2, the proposition, "the cat is on the mat," is it true? Why? Because the cat is not on the mat. We have something else on the mat. Aristotle famously defined truth in very simple terms, and he said this. In English, it's even all in words of one syllable, which is lovely. If one says of what is that it is, or of what is not that it is not, he speaks the truth. And if one says of what is that it is not, or of what is not that it is, he does not speak the truth. Now, amongst certain postmodern ways of thinking, this would be a very controversial claim to make. But it's also exceedingly difficult to escape from, exceedingly difficult to deny. Because when someone says they deny this concept of truth as correspondence to the facts, well, either they are denying that those are the facts, they're making a claim that they say describes the way that things really are, and that the way things really are is that truth really is not a correspondence between claim and reality. But of course, they're claiming that that's the reality of the situation. They're actually using this very correspondence concept of truth in the very attempt to deny that it is true. And if they're not really meaning to deny that it's true, then they're not denying that it's true, and I don't need to listen to them. And if they're trying to deny that it's true, what can they mean except they're making a truth claim about the facts of the matter? So you cannot get away from this correspondence view of truth without contradicting yourself, without relying on it in the very effort to get away from it. Today's earthly city, you might say, is divided into two districts or overlapping populations trying to live side by side. The modernist population and the postmodernist population, if you like. Nicholas Waterstorff, a philosopher from America, puts it like this. There is a dispute raging today between those who see the Enlightenment project of governing our existence by reason as an unfinished project, promising liberation on which we should continue to work. And on the other hand, those who see the project little but the tyranny of reason. The first party says that if we don't continue to govern our lives by reason, we can only expect more of the terrors of irrationalism. The second party says that if we do continue to govern our lives by reason, we can only expect more of the terrors of rationalism. That, in brief, is the dispute between the defenders of modernism and the defenders of postmodernism, intense and confused. And I call this talk a pre-modern view of postmodernism, because I want to say you don't have to choose a side in that battle. You can take a third option, a pre-modern worldview, a view that would say, actually, maybe both sides of this dispute have got something right, something true to say about the world, but that both of them are fundamentally wrong because they're part of the city of the world rather than the city of God. Once upon a time, we had a pre-modern worldview. And our pre-modern worldview led us to build buildings like this. This is a wonderful example of pre-modern architecture. This is Salisbury Cathedral from England. I remember the first time that I visited this on a school trip to hear an organ concert in the cathedral, and we pulled up outside and I looked at the cathedral and I thought, that is a really impressive building. And then I noticed the doors at the front, and that's a car. And so that's the size of a person. And then I thought, that is a really impressive building. And under this pre-modern way of looking at things, we looked into our pre-modern worldview mirror and we asked the famous question, just like the Queen in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Who is the fairest of them all? Tell us, my mirror of reality. And our mirror said something along these lines. God is the fairest of them all. God is the maximally great being, in Anselm's phrase. God is the most beautiful possible being. But God created this cosmos, this ordered beauty around us, and he made humanity in his image, only a little lower than the angels. And on this view, we're putting God at the very foundation, or the very apex of our view of reality. I just wanted to pick up on two of the things that have already happened today. We started off with that lovely violin music, and we had mention of the Trinity earlier. So I just wanted to import a couple of slides that would let me talk about music and the Trinity. I started off studying music at university before I went over to do philosophy. So a chord in music is one sound that is composed of three different sounds. You have the chord of C major, if I can go over to the piano briefly. So the chord of C major, you have the root of the chord, which is, funnily enough, C. And then you have the third note of the chord, which is E. And then the fifth note of the chord, which is G. Three separate sounds. One sound. Is it one sound or is it three sounds? Yes. God is one divine, personal being. the most beautiful personal reality that there can be. He is composed of three divine persons. The Father, the root of the divine chord, if you like, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, who together form the Godhead. And so there is this interrelationality of persons within the very nature of God. It's the only way in which God could be love, could contain love within himself and not be dependent upon some person outside of God in order to be love. God doesn't have to create in order to love. He is love, as John says in his gospel. And indeed, God contains both qualitatively different kinds of love. The Father loves the Son. This is one person loving another person. Together, the Father and the Son love the Spirit. This is not merely loving, but loving with a loved one. If you added a fourth person to God, you wouldn't get a qualitatively different type of love. And so you only need three persons in God to have the full expression of love in God. And that's why God is Trinitarian. So, that view of God, and particularly this Christian Trinitarian view of God, puts love and relationship at the foundation of understanding who we are as people. We're talking a lot about community and so on in your talk, and the world that we live in. And under this view of things, this is a charming medieval painting of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden with God and all of the animals surrounding. It's actually a view that many historians and philosophers of science have noted gave an impetus to the birth of scientific thinking. If God is a rational person who created this ordered beauty of the cosmos and created people in his image, people can expect not to comprehend God, but at least to understand something about God in whose image they're made, and also, of course, to understand something about the way in which the world, the cosmos that God has made works. Because, if you like, the rationality encoded in nature out there, and the way that the human mind happens to work in here, you can expect them to fit together because they both come from the same rational source. A source who you can expect to do things in a rational way, but whom you can also expect to exercise his freedom as a person, and therefore, unlike the ancient Greeks, you can't just sit back in your armchair and think, how must planets move? I suppose they must go in perfect circles. Because that's how I do it, you know. You can think, well, however planets move, it must be rationally understandable by us. There'll be a rationale. But God's got freedom to do it however he likes. So we better go and have a look. We better go and get the telescope and have a look and see how he did it and investigate. And the more we investigate that reality, that cosmos, that ordered beauty, the greater will our awe and respect and love for its creator become. So Alvin Plantinga, just a couple of quotes from him here. He says, modern science arose within the bosom of Christian theism. It's a shining example of the powers of reason which God has created in us, a spectacular display of the image of God in human beings. So Christians are committed to taking science with the utmost seriousness. And in his recently published book, Where the Conflict Really Lies, a book about the interaction between faith and science, really, he argues that it's theism, not naturalism, the worldview of modernism, that deserves to be called the scientific worldview. And to that I say, amen. And then one day, some people at least, looked in a different mirror, the modernist mirror, and they asked, mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all? Well, the modernist mirror said something along these lines. Well, according to science, which is the only way to know anything, man is the fairest of them all. Although an unverifiable value term like fair is nothing but an expression of emotion. Still, man is the most rational being that happens to have arisen via the blind watchmaker of Darwinian evolution, a child of Mother Nature who's finally come of age and rejected those childish superstitions about religion. Well, that has consequences. Ideas have consequences. We start building buildings like this. This is, I believe, Toronto in Canada. On the one hand, it's very impressive, isn't it? It's very vibrant. It's very colourful. It's life going on 24 hours a day because we've got electricity. And so we can tire ourselves out all day and all night. Woo. But it's also very impersonal. Everybody lives in their little cube, next to the other person living in their little cube. And we go to the office and work in our little cube. And maybe we might bump into the person in the next cube when we go to the water cooler, maybe not. Nancy Pearcey, in her wonderful book, Saving Leonardo, I think really puts her finger on something very important here when she talks about the fact-value divide. I think it is absolutely crucial that Christians do not buy into the idea that there is a divide, a gulf between facts and values. From a pre-modern perspective, there are facts about values. But from a modernist perspective, there aren't. Nancy Pearcey puts it this way. She says, the strict separation of facts from values is the key to unlocking the history of the modern Western mind. Now, of course, people have always known that there is a distinction between is and ought, between what you are and what you should be, between descriptive statements and normative statements. In earlier ages, however, people thought that both types of statement dealt with questions of truth. If you made a moral statement about what someone ought to do, you ought to love your children. You ought not to torture small children just for fun. That kind of statement was either true or false. Indeed, it's the only kind of view of values that allows you to be humble about values. Because it's the only view of values which allows you to say things like, well, I think that this is the right thing to do. This is what I ought to do. But I might be wrong about that. I might be wrong. And so I have to be humble. I have to listen to other people. I have to be open to changing my mind. Because, of course, if there is this distinction between facts and values, and there are no facts about values, I can never be wrong about ethics. Why put much effort into thinking about it if you can never be wrong about it? And so we have this, it doesn't show up particularly well here, but We have, the facts, and this is public and objective and universal and discovered by naturalistic scientific means. And here we have the subjective, personalized world of values. It's all subjective and relative and nothing to do with truth or facts. So, this fact-value distinction has tended to be supported in one of two different ways within modernism. Either by the idea that talk about values is literally meaningless, it's just nonsense talk, like nonsense poetry. Or the idea that they're meaningful but always false. Let's look at the first one, the idea that value propositions are meaningless. It's particularly associated with the logical positivism movement of the early 20th century. And in Britain, it was made particularly made inroads through A.J. Ayer at Oxford University and his 1936 book, Language, Truth and Logic. And the positivists had this idea about when language meant something. And their idea was that language only means something if it's true by definition, like 2 + 2 = 4, or you will never meet a married bachelor. It's just true by definition. Or it was meaningful if you could use your senses, use science in some way to verify it, to check it out, at least potentially. So, even before we'd gone to the dark side of the moon, it would still make sense to say the dark side of the moon is made of cheese. It might be a silly thing to say, but it's a meaningful thing to say. You can understand, you could debate about it, you could say, I know what you mean, and that's stupid. Okay? Whereas if it wasn't a meaningful claim, you couldn't even say, well, that's a stupid thing to say, because you wouldn't know what they'd said. It would just be gibberish. Because, at least in principle, if you were to find yourself on the dark side of the moon by a rocket ship or teleported there or whatever, you could try eating it. You could empirically verify that claim. Now, this kind of verification principle had all sorts of knock-on effects, including, of course, any value statements about ethics or aesthetics is nonsense. To say torturing small children for fun is wrong is just gibberish. To say rainbows are beautiful is just blah, 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 which in itself might give you pause for thought. If there's a philosophical theory, the consequence of which is that it's not true to say torturing small children for fun is wrong, because it's not even meaningful and therefore it can't be true, then you might think, well, so much the worse for that philosophical theory. That's a lot less plausible than my moral knowledge is. Also, Ayer in his book said this: God is a metaphysical term. And if God's a metaphysical term, then it can't even be probable that a God exists. For to say God exists is to make a metaphysical utterance, which cannot be either true or false. It fails to satisfy the verification principle. It's not a tautology. It's not true by definition. And being metaphysical, it's neither true nor false, but literally senseless. Which also means you can't literally be an atheist if you're a positivist. Being an atheist is just as meaningless as being a theist or being an agnostic. It just completely shoves that whole conversation off the table, kicks it into the long grass. However, as I've indicated, we do know some things that are meaningful that don't fit this verification criteria. It seems to me obvious that torturing small children for fun is wrong, and that therefore, obviously, that's a meaningful claim, and obviously it doesn't fit the verification. It's not meaningful because it's true by definition. It's not meaningful because we can do some experiment that would prove it. Well, so much for verificationism in my book. Religious claims, which were really the target, the motivation behind logical positivism, actually can fit the criteria. The British philosopher called John Hick pointed out that particularly Christianity, since it's this historical revelation claim that you could empirically investigate, like by doing archaeology or talking about the historical evidence for the resurrection, or, as Hick pointed out, supposing you die and you find yourself in what is clearly the Christian picture of heaven. Wouldn't that empirical experience, oh, here I am in my new resurrected body, before the pearly gates, shaking hands with St. Paul, wouldn't that verify the truth of Christianity? So the truth of Christianity is at least verifiable in principle, which is all the criteria stipulated. And indeed, what about the verification criteria? Is it true by definition that any sentence that doesn't pass the verification criteria is meaningful or not meaningful? What empirical observations could you make to prove that the verification criteria is true? None. It's just a philosophical assertion. It doesn't pass its own standard. Like trying to deny that truth is correspondence to fact, it just contradicts itself. And so in the middle half of the 20th century, the whole logical positivism school died a death. Interestingly enough, I've been reading with me a book on the cosmological argument by Bruce Reichenbach, published in 1972. And he's talking in the preface to this book. He says, "The era is past when all metaphysical statements or arguments can simply be dismissed as silly or senseless, since they do not meet a pre-established criterion of verifiability." He says there's now a gradual awakening of interest in philosophical theology and arguments for God and so on. The whole conversation about God got put back on the table of philosophy when verificationism died a death. And indeed, A.J. Ayer himself, later on in life, abandoned verificationism. I won't read these quotes out to you, but you can see just a sampling of quotes from him here saying the whole thing was full of mistakes and it's dead. So modernism kind of moved away from that, its meaningless route, and said, okay, let's not use science and so on as a way of telling meaning from meaninglessness, but let's use it as the only way of knowing true from false. Let's not talk about meaning, but let's talk about truth and say science is the only way to get at truth. Here's a contemporary British atheist called Peter Atkins. In his recent book on being, he says, "The scientific method is the only means of discovering the nature of reality, the only way of acquiring reliable knowledge." Here's a little video clip from a post-debate discussion between Peter Atkins and William Lane Craig. This one's from their debate in the 90s. They had a recent rematch in Britain, which is all over YouTube as well. I recommend you check it out. But here's William Lane Craig systematically dismantling Peter Atkins' view that science is the only way to know anything.
Also adequate, but taken together, the fact that science is omnipotent, and the fact that why people like you desperately want to believe in God, that is an argument against the existence of God.
But two fallacious arguments put together don't make a sound argument, right?
But do you deny that science cannot account for everything?
Yes, I do deny that science...
So what can't it account for?
Well, had you brought that up in the debate, I had a number of examples that I was going to give. I think there are a good number of things that cannot be scientifically proven, but that we're all rational to accept. Let me list 5. Logical and mathematical truths cannot be proven by science. science presupposes logic and math, so that to try to prove them by science would be arguing in a circle. Metaphysical truths like there are other minds other than my own, or that the external world is real, or that the past was not created 5 minutes ago with an appearance of age, are rational beliefs that cannot be scientifically proven. Ethical beliefs about statements of value are not accessible by the scientific method. You can't show by science whether the Nazi scientists in the camps did anything evil as opposed to the scientists in Western democracies. Aesthetic judgments, number 4, cannot be accessed by the scientific method because the beautiful, like the good, cannot be scientifically proven. And finally, most remarkably, would be science itself. Science cannot be justified by the scientific method. Science is permeated with unprovable assumptions. For example, in the special theory of relativity, the whole theory hinges on the assumption that the speed of light is constant in a one-way direction between any 2 points A and B. But that strictly cannot be proven. We simply have to assume that in order to hold to the theory.
You're missing the whole.
So put that in your pipe and smoke it.
Yeah,
So we are, none of these beliefs can be scientifically proven, and yet they are accepted by all of us, and we're rational.
The look on Atkins' face is just priceless, isn't it? So now I arrive at the topic that I'm meant to be talking about, having put it in some context. And then one day, some people who understandably might be a little bit annoyed at this kind of imperialistic, modernistic, impersonal, depersonalizing, science is the only way to know anything, or even talk about ethics and beauty and so on is just meaningless. Wanted to look in a different mirror and get a different view of themselves and of reality. But the crucial thing here is that they didn't, or not all of them, didn't go back to the pre-modern way of viewing things. One day we looked into the postmodern worldview mirror and asked, who is the fairest of them all? And the postmodern mirror said something along these lines, and this summary that I've put together includes quite a few quotations from postmodernists. Bonus prizes later for those who can spot them. Although words only mean whatever they mean to you, I'd say that if I can get my colleagues to let me get away with saying, I'm the fairest of them all, then I am the fairest of them all. After all, values are merely subjective concepts programmed into the human animal by the blind watchmaker of evolution, which only cares about what works, and which doesn't care about truth any more than it cares about goodness or beauty. Why should we care about truth? We must keep faith with Darwin and admit we know that all we can know is the subjective meaning of our own words. The French philosopher Francis Lyotard characterized postmodern thinking as an incredulity towards meta-narratives. He must be a philosopher because he's using long words to mean simple things. And this is what we have an unfortunate tendency of doing. Being skeptical about having a big picture of things. Being skeptical about there being an overall story to life that makes sense. Of course, that is his meta-narrative. Nobody lives without a worldview. And on the basis of postmodernism, people started building buildings like this. This is the Rexner Center for the Performing Arts in America. And Ravi Zacharias, the Indian apologist, tells a fascinating story about visiting America and seeing this building. He says, postmodernism tells us that there's no such thing as truth, no such thing as meaning, no such thing as certainty. I remember lecturing at Ohio State University, one of the largest in the country. I was minutes away from beginning my lecture, and my host was driving me past a new building called the Rexner Center for the Performing Arts. And he said, this is America's first postmodern building. I was startled for a moment, and I said, what's a postmodern building? He said, well, the architect said that he designed this building with no design in mind. When the architect was asked why, he said, well, if life itself is capricious, why should our buildings have any design or any meaning? So he has pillars that have no purpose. He has stairways that go nowhere. He has a senseless building built and somebody's paid for it. I said, so his argument was that if life has no purpose and design, why should the building have any design? He said, that's correct. And I said, did he do the same with the foundation? All of a sudden there was silence. You see, you and I can fool around with the infrastructure as much as we'd like, but we dare not fool with the foundation because it will call our bluff in a hurry. And so I think William Lane Craig is kind of on to something when he says that the idea that we live in a postmodern culture is a myth, in a sense. He says a postmodern culture is an impossibility. It would be utterly unlivable. And indeed, I think the closer somebody tries to really live out a postmodern worldview, the worse the effects on their life is going to be. The more consistent they are to that system, as Francis Schaeffer might have put it, the more hurt and harm they're going to be doing to themselves. And that is one reason why our motive of love for people comes in here. This is not just about us being right. This is about us loving people who need the God of love. People are not relativistic, says Craig, when it comes to matters of science, engineering, and technology. Nobody reads the instructions on the aspirin bottle as a postmodernist, deconstructionist, reader response. Texts only mean whatever they mean to you. Take as many tablets as you like. Kind of a way. Because they know if they do that, they might very soon end up dead. It's only in matters of religion or ethics or these things that the modernist view have said, that's all to do with the private, individual, subjective, personal, not communal world. In matters of religion and ethics, people are subjectivist. But of course, says Craig, that's not postmodernism. That's modernism. That's just old line verificationism. We live in a culture that remains deeply modernist. And I think he has a point, but maybe only up to a point, as it were. J.P. Moreland recently published a paper in which he distinguished between 4 different levels of depth of postmodernism, as it were. And they all have fancy Greek names, but let's not use those. So we start out at the bottom there with value-denying postmodernism, which is really modernism. Okay? There's a big overlap there. But then as we move, this is sort of shallow postmodernism, if you like. But we move into deep postmodernism and deeper into postmodernism as we work up this list. There would then be knowledge-denying postmodernism, truth-denying postmodernism, Not only don't we know the truth, we can't know the truth, but there isn't even any truth to be known, which is an even sort of deeper doubt to have. And then the deepest is this reality-denying postmodernism. Not only is there no truth, there's no reality about which there could be any truth. So Douglas Greathouse says, a bit like Craig, that postmodernism is often presented as a radical departure from modernism, but at least when we're talking about the shallow postmodernism, they're really the same thing. There's an overlap here, and I want to try and diagram this overlap for you. Here we have the pre-modern worldview. You know, it's very big on God, it's very big on science. This is fine, these go together nicely. It's very big on objective values, truth and goodness and beauty, and wisdom and reason, and objective meaning and purpose and all of that. And modernism comes along and says, well, we don't really want this God stuff, thank you very much. We've outgrown all of that. But we'd like to keep hold of reason and science. We like science, woohoo, science. And truth, of course, because science is about truth and, you know, technology and so on, but we'll do without some of that fluffier meaning and values and so on, you know. Yeah. So we're nice and hard and modernistic and science and truth, which means we're kind of a little bit shallowly postmodern when it comes to values. We have this fact-value divide. And the postmodernist comes along and says, well, okay, this is sort of shallow here and so on, but there's a deeper postmodernism where we're really rejecting reason and objective truth, even about things that aren't about values. There's a sort of process of decay from a pre-modern viewpoint there, isn't there? I was so pleased to hear Nietzsche being mentioned earlier. This validates what I think. I'm not the only one who thinks it. Particularly when you're getting into deep postmodernism here. What's the difference between postmodernism and nihilism? Maybe you could describe Nietzsche as the first nihilist, or sometimes you read him and you think he's warning against nihilism. Sometimes you read him and you think he's embracing nihilism. It's difficult to tell. It says, nihilism represents the ultimate logical conclusion of our great values and ideals, particularly, of course, the rejection of God, the death of God. His famous parable of the madman, proclaiming the consequences of the death of God, which he says people don't realize these consequences. They're sort of still living as modernists because they don't realize it. Have I got time to read out the parable of the madman? How are we doing for time, Mario?
Go like 5 more minutes.
Okay, we're quite tight. So you have it up there and you can get the gist of the parable of the madman. It's easily available online as well. Just Google Nietzsche, the parable of the madman. It goes from God is dead to we've unchained our reality from its sun. There's no up and down left. There's no horizon, no standard of judgment. Not just about values, but about anything. He says the great recent event that God is dead is beginning to cast its first shadows over Europe. He talks about suspicion, the suspicion that some sun seems to have set and some ancient and profound trust has been turned into doubt. If you want a one-sentence summary of postmodernism, trust has been turned into doubt. Don't think you could do much better. How much must collapse now that that faith has been undermined because it was built on this faith in God? For example, the whole of our European morality. When one gives up the Christian faith, one pulls the right to Christian morality out from under one's feet. And Nietzsche wrote one of his books criticizing ethical philosophers who wanted to do away with God but keep all of the traditional values. And at least people like Peter Singer, you might say, are being more consistent to their non-theistic way of viewing the world in undermining those traditional values being more consistent to their non-Christian way of viewing things. Even denying knowledge. These are fascinating because here is Richard Rorty is a prime kind of postmodernist philosopher, and here he is undermining human trust in knowledge and reasoning on very modernist-sounding grounds. It was him who talked about keeping faith with Darwin. He says, the idea that one species of organism is, unlike all the others, orientated not just towards its own increased propensity, but towards truth, with a capital T, is as un-Darwinian as the idea that every human being has a built-in moral compass. So you get rid of God, it's not just moral values that go, but truth with a capital T that goes. John Gray says something very similar in that quote here. He says, the human mind serves evolutionary success, not truth. To think otherwise is to resurrect the pre-Darwinian era that humans are different from other animals. Truth has no systematic evolutionary advantage over error. And so that very scientistic, modernistic way of looking at the world starts to undermine the fact that it wants to hold on to truth and rationality and science whilst getting rid of God. It was Nietzsche who said, why should you pay attention to truth? If you have a fact-value distinction, if there's no truth about values, it is not true to say you ought to value truth. You ought to guide your decisions by what is true by your best lights rather than what you think might make you happiest. Maybe those come adrift. Who knows? It's all up for grabs. What is truth? A movable host of metaphors. It's a little enigmatic, but Nietzsche even said, I fear we'll never be rid of God so long as we still believe in grammar. As long as we still believe that our language gives us access not just to our language, but to reality. And if our language really can give us access to reality, then maybe that needs to depend upon us being rational creatures made in the image of God. And so, let me end with a verse from the Bible. Matthew 16, 24 to 26. It seems to me, and I'm kind of partially agreeing with Nietzsche here, that there is an inner tension within modernism that if you don't wind the clock back to a pre-modern view, drives you towards postmodernism. Jesus said to his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for you to gain your whole world or the privilege of establishing your own non-God-centered worldview, yet forfeit your soul? And maybe that's just as true at the philosophical, at the social level as it is at the individual personal level. Thank you.